might not take place if the war intensifies.
In Jerusalem, Israelis expressed their welcome to
That administers the test says the trend shows kids are less ready for college than before.
the average score is now 19.5 out of 36. Authorities attribute the fall to adjustments made to schooling during the COVID pandemic.
But ACT scores have been on the decline for 6 straight years, long before COVID.
Dumbing down the
many
children.
experts say standardized tests are not good predictors of college success.
The University of Chicago found high school grade point averages are 5 times better at forecasting success. Many schools, including Harvard, no longer require applicants to submit standardized test scores for admission.
The college admissions scan that came to light in 2019 also shined a light on how some students can cheat on the tests.
Speaking of schooling, a Florida school district is catching up with the state's move toward a more conservative school curriculum.
The Miami-Dade School Board approved new social studies, history, geography, and civics textbooks for grades 1 through 12. They'll go into use in the 2024 to 2025 school year.
New legislation signed by Governor Ron DeSantis bans public schools from teaching that a person is privileged or oppressed based on race or skin color. Up next, guilty on tax fraud charges. The amount in question, almost $500 million. Find out if the former Formula One boss got any jail time.
A major firm in Australia leaked confidential government tax plans. This week, the chief executive appeared before senators. That and more when we return.
Ismail Haniyeh, who also might be the brain behind the attacks on Israel.
These terrorists and political leaders are welcomed on Qatari soil, from where they can launch calls for jihad, calling on Muslims to give their lives for the massacre of Jews.
Alexandre Delval is an author and expert on radical Islamist terrorism. He says, despite what he read in the mainstream media, it's not Iran, but Qatar that's the Hamas's primary sponsor.
Qatar, on an official basis alone, gives 22 to 23 million euros every month to pay the 20 to 30,000, some say 10 to 40,000 Hamas officials who run the Gaza Strip. That's official funding. There's probably a lot more unofficial aid to Hamas. Some say 10 times more than what is official.
Qatar's leaders have showed opposition to the Abraham Accords, a US-sponsored peace agreement which normalized the relations between Israel and some Arab states, arguing it couldn't contribute to peace. While Qatar continues its support for Hamas, it also intends to play a mediator role. Qatar is now involved in talks with Hamas and Israeli officials over a possible swap between Israeli women and children seized by the terror group and held in Gaza in exchange for the release of Palestinian women and children. Delval says he met with a Qatari embassy official in Paris and asked him why the country provided support to Hamas.
The Qatari ambassador told me it's not to support their fight. It's about Bedouin hospitality, which then allows us to have contacts with everyone and which then allows us to negotiate the release of the hostages. You should be happy that we are involved. The fact that we have close ties with these radical Islamists means that we can help you when some of them go too far, because we are their friends.
Delval says the country's leaders are engaged in a double game with the West.
A country that has been sponsoring most of the Islamist movements for years, while saying that it will help us free the hostages. I don't want to be cartoonish here, but it reminds me of the mafia. They come to protect you. If you give them a ransom, they will protect you from themselves.
David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
Organisation, Party for Socialism Liberation, have participated with Palestinian supporters in major rallies across the United States and come, all across the West. We've seen this phenomenon, this alliance of the communists and the radical Islamists. But it goes right back. The Soviet Union used the Palestine Liberation Organization and Hamas as proxies in their war against the West and their war against Israel. But that policy never changed with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russians are still very actively involved with the Taliban, very actively involved with Hamas. Hamas has been to Moscow 3 times in the last year, and since these atrocities have been committed, have publicly claimed that Moscow is with them, that Moscow sympathizes with them.
Those are very interesting revelations, Trevor. Let's continue to look at the big picture here. Analysts are saying that in the 75 years of Israel's existence, they have never seen anything like this recent terrorist attack by Hamas, and it equates to their 9/11. And if you remember, of course, the United States launched a 20-year war after its 9/11. So why are Communist Party groups within Israel and around the world condemning the Israeli response here?
Well, because this is, as your commentator said before, as your partner there said before, it's a to a Marxist, the oppressed is always in the right. So this is, the police are brutal, therefore criminals are only doing what they're forced to do. So therefore, we shouldn't prosecute crime. We should let criminals out of jail. Well, this is the same with the terrorists. The terrorists are only forced to do what they do by the Israeli oppressors, so we should stand with the poor terrorists because it's not their fault. It's the fault of Israel. It's the fault of the oppressing nation. So this is a basic Marxist way of looking at the world. We see it playing out in the lack of criminal enforcement in the United States, and we're seeing it playing out here with sympathy for the terrorists, not for the victims.
It is very hard to sympathize with people who come down on motorized paragliders and start spraying bullets into crowds, killing people at a music festival. You talk about ideology here, Trevor. Are there similarities between communism's call for violent revolution and radical Islamists' use of heinous killings to gain power?
Look, very much so. They are natural allies in this. They're both, but I would say this, Islamic terrorism would not exist in the form that we see it without the backing of their communist or neo-communist allies. The Soviet Union, China, and Iran, which is basically a proxy of the Soviet Union. Most of Iran's leaders trained at the Patrice Lumumba School in Moscow. They're very loyal to Moscow. We wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing without logistic support, moral support, and financial support from the communist bloc, or the neo-communist bloc, I should say. So yeah, it's what we see as Islamic terrorism is basically a front for communism.
Speaking of communism, Communist China has not overtly condemned the terrorist attack by Hamas. Why do you think that is?
Well, because they are sympathetic. China has deep relationships with Iran, and they're trying to cultivate more deep relationships with Saudi Arabia and other countries. They may be persecuting their own Muslim minorities, so that's a sensitive issue too. But they are on the side of the terrorists, and they're saying Israel should now declare a ceasefire. So Israel is supposed to accept massive slaughter in their own territory and not retaliate because the Chinese say they should hold a ceasefire. Well, who does that benefit? It's only going to benefit the terrorists because that's who the Chinese Communist Party sympathizes with and actively supports.
It's right out of the playbook, and if you remember the documentary Agenda, it's that the communists will push their ideology and they'll get some policies passed, and then they will call everyone to just back off when everyone starts, and they'll keep pushing it. So do communists and terrorists have a common goal, and does the Hamas attack serve to further that cause?
Look, 100%. This is rallying revolutionary forces all around the world. It is also taking pressure off Russia's war in Ukraine because Russians are suffering badly there. And so this is now diverting attention away from that. And what they're trying to use this for is to undermine Western support for Ukraine, saying, no, we can't afford we've got to support Israel, but Ukraine is too much, you know. And we've already seen pressure from some American politicians along these lines. So this is really a second front. And I think the third front may be some attacks within America itself, or certainly in other Western countries. And we've already heard calls for a global day of jihad this Friday the 13th for attacks on Jews, terrorist incidents, and rallies for Palestine all over the world, backed in every country by the local communist parties.
Well, thank you so much for bringing a lot of clarity to this issue. Trevor Loudon, Epoch Times contributor and author of The Enemies Within.
Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. It was created by Ahmed Yassin and 6 other Muslims in 1987. It is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, an extremist organization that has expressed hostility towards Israel and the West. Hamas stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. The National Counterterrorism Center says it has between 20 and 25,000 members. Terrorist members wear a green headband, and the group has both a military as well as a political unit. Hamas's charter calls for the Jewish state to be wiped off the map. Hamas took power in Gaza in 2006 after winning an election that has been contested for its lack of integrity. The terror group is known for using civilian centers in Gaza, including hospitals and schools, to launch rockets into Israel. It also uses civilians as human shields when targeted by Israeli forces. Hamas is known to receive financial and other support from Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism. The Wall Street Journal also reported on October 8th that Iran helped Hamas plan the attacks and gave it the green light to execute them. According to a Foundation for Defense of Democracy's report, Iran has built a network of at least 19 armed groups on Israel's borders. The biggest ones are Hamas and Islamic Jihad, based in Gaza, and Hezbollah, based in Lebanon. These groups and others receive funding, training, and weapons from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Qatar is also accused of being a major supporter of Hamas, and that's where Hamas's leader, Ismail Haniyeh, currently resides. Qatar denies these allegations. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Progressive Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush are facing backlash for their responses to the war. Tlaib wanted to withhold U.S. funds from Israel after the attacks from Hamas. She also categorized the terror attacks as part of a resistance effort. Bush agreed with her. The two then faced heavy pushback from members of their own party, most of whom support Israel.
What exactly is Hamas? NTD's Daniel Monahan has some background information. Why are some Americans thinking this way? To dive into it, we spoke with Alex Newman, an award-winning international journalist and the president of Liberty Sentinel Media. Alex Newman, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Following the horrors coming out of Israel, we're seeing some left-leaning groups cheering on the Hamas terror group. For example, you have BLM coming out in support with pro-Palestine messages. What's the connection?
Well, this is actually not a new phenomenon. This has been going on for a very long time, and we know from many high-level Soviet defectors, including Ion Pacepa, who was the head of Romanian intelligence, that the communists had a plan to radicalize and further inflame Islamic hatred toward Jews, toward Americans. In fact, Ion Pacepa, in his book, he quotes Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, as explaining that 1 billion Muslims could inflict far more damage on the United States and its allies than just the communists could alone. So he actually estimated, Ion Pacepa, that they had sent in 4,000 KGB and communist agents into the Islamic world to radicalize Muslims, to teach them that the United States was the great Satan and that Israel was the little Satan. And, of course, this is a long history in the Arab terrorism directed at Israel. The PLO was actually basically a Soviet front group. When you look at the founding back in the 1960s in Egypt, they didn't even mention Islam. It was all about revolution and Arab revolutionary activities. So this is not a new phenomenon. Of course, the Communist Chinese participated in this as well. And, that's not to completely deny the influence of Islamic theology in a lot of this, but really the communist nexus has been there for generations, and it should be very obvious to anybody who's looking.
And Alex, you actually